The railway from Manchester had deposited Thomas Whitmore at Windermere Station on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-June 1863, though he would remember it less for the date than for the peculiar quality of light that seemed to hang over the Lake District like a veil of amber gauze. Our cartographer, 34 years of age, and already bearing the slight limp that marked him as a man who'd paid his dues to the unforgiving god of precise measurement, stood on the platform with his leather cases of instruments, watching the steam dissipate into the Cumberland air. The hiring carriage that would take him to Thornwick Estate waited beyond the station, its driver, a taciturn fellow with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades navigating these narrow lanes, barely acknowledged Thomas beyond a grunt and a gesture toward the luggage. As they wound their way through the valleys, past the slate quarries that scarred the hillsides like geometric wounds, Thomas found himself calculating distances automatically, his mind converting the landscape into contour lines and elevation markers. It was a habit he'd developed over 15 years of work, this constant translation of the world into measurable quantities. Thornwick Estate revealed itself gradually, first as a break in the tree line, then as cultivated parkland, and finally as an imposing Georgian mansion of local stone, its windows catching the afternoon sun like signals from a heliograph. The estate sprawled across 2,000 acres, or so Lord Thornwick's letter had claimed, though Thomas knew from experience that landowners often inflated their holdings by 10 to 15%, a harmless vanity that his precise measurements would quietly correct. Lord Edmund Thornwick himself appeared at the main entrance before the carriage had fully stopped, an unusual courtesy that immediately put Thomas on his guard. In his years of surveying estates, he'd learned that the wealthy typically made you wait, their time being more valuable than yours by virtue of their bank accounts. Yet here stood a man of 58 years, prosperously stout in the manner of successful industrialists, his mutton chops meticulously groomed, extending his hand as if Thomas were a colleague rather than a hired tradesman. "Whitmore, capital, absolutely capital that you've come," Lord Thornwick boomed, his voice carrying the forced joviality that Thomas recognized as the hallmark of a worried man trying not to show it. "Your reputation precedes you. That business with the Ashford boundary dispute, masterfully handled, or so I heard from Lord Ashford himself at the club." Thomas accepted the handshake, noting the soft palm that had never held a surveyor's chain, and responded with appropriate professional restraint. "Your lordship is kind to say so. The Ashford matter was simply a question of applying proper triangulation methods to establish the original boundaries from the 1798 deed." They walked through the entrance hall, Thomas's trained eye automatically cataloging the dimensions. 16 feet to the ceiling, he estimated, with the staircase occupying roughly 1/7 of the floor space. The walls displayed the usual collection of ancestral portraits, their subjects gazing down with that mixture of pride and dyspepsia common to painted aristocracy. Lord Thornwick led him to a study that overlooked the estate's most prominent feature, a lake perhaps 3/4 of a mile in length, its surface mirror smooth in the still air. "Now then," Lord Thornwick began, settling behind a mahogany desk that could have served as a small boat, "the commission is straightforward enough. I require a complete topographical survey of the estate, accurate to modern standards. The last proper mapping was done in 1821, and frankly, I suspect old Jameson was drunk half the time he was working." Thomas withdrew his notebook, a worn leather journal that had accompanied him across half of England. "Certainly achievable, your lordship. I'll need approximately 8 to 10 weeks for an estate of this size, assuming favorable weather and adequate assistance with the chain work." "You'll have whatever you need," Lord Thornwick assured him, though his eyes drifted toward the lake as he spoke. "There is one particular area that requires special attention. The lake, you see, has certain peculiarities that the previous surveys have never quite captured accurately." The way he said peculiarities made Thomas look up from his notes. In his experience, when clients used euphemisms about their land, they were usually trying to hide something. A disputed boundary, an easement they'd rather not acknowledge, or sometimes, more interestingly, something they themselves didn't quite understand. Before Thomas could probe further, a woman entered the study without knocking, her bearing suggesting she had every right to do so. Lady Catherine Thornwick, as she introduced herself, was 16 years her husband's junior, with the kind of sharp intelligence in her eyes that suggested she'd earned her position through more than just beauty, though she possessed that too in a refined, careful way. "You must be our cartographer," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that was both gracious and subtly testing. "I trust my husband has explained the importance of accuracy in this endeavor." "Mr. Whitmore comes highly recommended, my dear," Lord Thornwick interjected quickly. "His work on the Ashford estate—" "Yes, Edmund. I heard you from the hall," Lady Catherine replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She turned back to Thomas. "You'll be staying in the converted coach house. It's quite comfortable, and more importantly for your work, it has an excellent view of the lake." Thomas noted the emphasis she placed on that last detail, the lake again. Whatever secret Thornwick estate harbored, it seemed to rest in or near that body of water. His professional pride stirred. There was nothing he enjoyed more than reducing mysteries to measurable facts. The coach house proved to be more than comfortable. It was positively luxurious by Thomas's standards. Someone, probably Lady Catherine, had ensured it was furnished with a large work table, perfect for spreading maps, good lighting, and even a small telescope by the window. As he unpacked his theodolite, his chains, his compasses and levels, Thomas felt the familiar satisfaction of preparing for work that he both understood and excelled at. That evening, as the sun set behind the Cumbrian hills, he stood at his window watching the lake change colors, from silver to gold to deep purple. Tomorrow, he would begin his measurements, would start the process of converting this landscape into lines and numbers, into something precise and knowable. Yet something about the way the mist began to rise from the water as the temperature dropped, the way it seemed to coalesce into shapes that weren't quite there when you looked directly at them, suggested that Thornwick Estate might resist such easy translation. He thought of his sister Mary back in Manchester, waiting for the money he would send from this commission, her 3 children needing shoes and school fees. This job would keep them comfortable through the winter. Thomas had learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury a working man couldn't afford, yet he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction that his skills with theodolite and chain could provide for those he loved. The lake grew dark, becoming a void in the landscape rather than a feature of it. Somewhere in the big house, a clock chimed 9. Thomas turned from the window and lit his lamp, spreading out the old 1821 survey on his table. Even by lamplight, he could see the oddities in old Jameson's work: inconsistent scale, impossible elevations. And there, marked on the lake itself, a small island that seemed to exist in some drawings but not in others, as if Jameson himself hadn't been quite sure whether it was there or not. The morning of June 16th arrived with a kind of pristine clarity that makes the Lake District seem like God's own survey map. Every feature distinct and measurable. Thomas had risen at 4:30, a habit formed from years of catching the best light for observations, and now stood at his window with a cup of bitter tea, watching the lake emerge from darkness like a photograph developing in solution. It was then that he saw it, or rather, saw what shouldn't have been there according to any map he'd studied the night before. Rising from the lake's surface, perhaps 300 yards from the eastern shore, stood an island. Not large, maybe 40 feet across, but undeniably present, with what appeared to be stunted trees or shrubs crowning its modest elevation. The morning mist clung to it like cotton wool, giving it an ethereal quality that seemed to justify its absence from Jameson's more sober documentations. Thomas rubbed his eyes, looked again, still there. He reached for the telescope, adjusted the focus, and studied this geographical impossibility. Through the lens, the island appeared even more substantial, though something about its edges seemed to waver, as if he were viewing it through heated air. He sketched quickly in his notebook, recording the time, 5:23, and the atmospheric conditions, clear, still, temperature approximately 52 degrees by his estimation. "You're up early, Mr. Whitmore, sir." Thomas nearly dropped the telescope. In the doorway stood an elderly man in groundskeeper's clothing, his face a map of wrinkles that suggested he'd been old when Victoria took the throne, and had only gotten older since. This would be Tom Craddock, whom Lord Thornwick had mentioned would assist with local knowledge. "I like to observe the landscape in different lights," Thomas replied, recovering his composure. "Tell me, Craddock, that island there, why isn't it on any of the estate maps?" Old Tom's face underwent a transformation that would have been comical if it weren't so genuinely fearful. He crossed himself, a gesture that seemed to belong to an earlier century, and shook his head vigorously. "Best not to speak of it, sir. Not that island. It's not meant for Christian folks to set foot upon." "Surely you don't believe in such superstitions," Thomas said, though he kept his tone gentle. In his experience, local folklore often contained kernels of practical truth wrapped in layers of mysticism. "Believe what you like, sir," Old Tom replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But I've worked this estate for 50 years, man and boy, and I've seen what happens to those who try to reach that cursed place. Young Master Francis, that would be his lordship's elder brother, took a boat out in the summer of '38. They found the boat, but never found him." The island had gone by then, you see. It comes and goes as it pleases, like it's not properly part of God's creation. Thomas made notes while Old Tom spoke, his pencil recording not just the words, but the genuine fear behind them. Whatever the explanation for this island's appearance, it had certainly captured the local imagination. "How often does it appear?" he asked. "Only at dawn, sir, and only when the conditions are just so. Sometimes you won't see it for weeks, then it'll show itself 3 mornings running. My old dad, he worked here before me, said it was a judgment on the family for some ancient wrong, though he never would say what." After Old Tom departed, muttering about having roses to tend, Thomas dressed properly and made his way to the main house. The library, he'd been told, occupied the entire East Wing's ground floor, and it was there he hoped to find historical records that might shed light on this mysterious island. Margaret Bellwether stood on a ladder when he entered, reaching for a volume on a high shelf, her practical gray dress and severe hairstyle marking her as someone who took her position as librarian seriously. She was perhaps 28, with the kind of face that revealed intelligence before beauty, though it possessed both. As Thomas watched, she extracted the volume with practiced efficiency and descended the ladder with more grace than her purposeful demeanor might have suggested. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, having noticed him without appearing to, "Lord Thornwick mentioned you might require access to the historical surveys. I've already pulled the relevant materials." She led him to a reading table where several leather-bound volumes lay open, their pages yellow with age. Thomas found himself impressed by her efficiency, and said so. A slight smile crossed her features. "My father was a state manager here for 20 years. I practically grew up in this library." "I know where all the bodies are buried, so to speak." An interesting choice of phrase, Thomas thought, but before he could pursue it, she was pointing to a particular map dated 1790. "Here's the first mention of what the locals call Ghost Island. You'll notice the cartographer has marked it with a question mark." Indeed, there it was, a small circular marking in approximately the location where Thomas had observed the island that morning. Beside it, in fading ink, someone had written, "Insula Phantasma, visible only at dawn when the mists rise." "Latin," Thomas observed. "Rather grandiose for a geographical feature." "The Thornwick who commissioned that map had pretensions to scholarship," Margaret explained. "He spent 20 years trying to prove that the Romans had a settlement here. Never found any evidence, of course, but he did collect rather a lot of local folklore." She pulled another volume forward. "This is his journal." The entry for August 15th, 1793 might interest you. Thomas read the indicated passage, written in the cramped hand of someone trying to squeeze too many thoughts onto expensive paper. "The Phantom Island appeared again this morning. I have now observed it on 43 occasions over 5 years. It seems to require very specific atmospheric conditions, still air, temperature between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and most crucially, it appears only when the lake's surface temperature differs from the air above by at least 10 degrees. I begin to suspect this is no supernatural phenomenon, but some trick of nature not yet understood by science." "A man ahead of his time," Thomas murmured, appreciating this long-dead amateur scientist's methodical approach. "He disappeared in 1794, Margaret said quietly. "Went out one morning to investigate the island more closely. His boat was found drifting, completely empty." The island, of course, was gone by the time searchers arrived. Thomas looked up from the journal to find Margaret watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You don't believe in curses, I take it?" she asked. "I believe in measurement and observation," Thomas replied carefully. "Most mysteries yield to patient investigation. And those that don't?" Before he could answer, the library door opened and a younger man entered. James Thornwick, if Thomas's guess was correct. Lord Thornwick's son had the dissipated look of someone who'd discovered life's pleasures early and hadn't yet learned their price. His clothes were expensive but carelessly worn, and his eyes, when they fixed on Thomas, held a calculating quality that put the cartographer immediately on edge. "So you're the map maker," James said, his tone suggesting the profession ranked somewhere between rat catcher and chimney sweep in his estimation. "Father says you're to have run of the estate." "Seems rather excessive for drawing lines on paper." "Accurate surveying requires thorough investigation," Thomas replied mildly. He'd dealt with enough hostile landowners' sons to know that taking offense only encouraged them. James's gaze shifted to the old maps spread on the table, and something flickered in his expression. Was it concern? Looking into ancient history, are we? I'd have thought a modern survey would focus on present realities. Understanding the history of a landscape often reveals present truths, Thomas said, watching James carefully. Previous surveys can show changes in water levels, erosion patterns, all sorts of useful information. How fascinating, James replied in a tone that suggested it was anything but. He moved closer to the table, and Thomas noticed how his eyes lingered on the mentions of Ghost Island. Well, don't let old Tom Craddock fill your head with his ghost stories. The man's been telling tales about that non-existent island for as long as I can remember. Pure imagination, of course. Yet even as he dismissed it, James's hand trembled slightly as he pointed to the map, and Thomas filed this observation away with all the others he'd collected that morning. Whatever Ghost Island was or wasn't, it certainly provoked strong reactions in those familiar with it. The theodolite arrived from the coach house on the morning of June 18th, carried by 2 local laborers Thomas had hired for the duration of the survey. The instrument, a brass beauty made by Troughton and Sims of London, represented nearly a year's worth of savings, but Thomas treated it with the reverence a violinist might show a Stradivarius. As he supervised its placement on the southern shore of the lake, he noticed James Thornwick watching from an upstairs window of the main house, his face partially concealed by a curtain. The laborers, brothers named William and Joseph Hartwell, proved more competent than Thomas had dared hope. William, the elder at perhaps 40, had worked on the railway surveys that had carved through the district 5 years prior, while Joseph, younger by a decade, possessed the kind of natural understanding of angles and distances that couldn't be taught. They handled the measuring chains with practiced efficiency, though Thomas noticed how they both avoided looking directly at the lake's center, where Ghost Island had appeared for the past 3 mornings. We'll establish our primary baseline here, Thomas explained, driving an iron stake into the ground with precise taps of his hammer. 200 yards exactly, parallel to the shore. From each end, we'll triangulate to fixed points across the water. William nodded his understanding, but shifted uncomfortably. Begging your pardon, Mr. Whitmore, but you're not planning to measure to that place, are you? Every feature within the estate boundaries must be documented, Thomas replied, keeping his tone neutral. If something exists, it gets measured. And if it doesn't exist? Joseph asked quietly, voicing what Thomas suspected many locals wondered about Ghost Island. Then my measurements will prove it doesn't, Thomas said simply. Mathematics doesn't lie, gentlemen. Unlike memory or perception, numbers tell us what's actually there. They worked through the morning, establishing reference points with the methodical patience that good surveying demanded. Thomas found himself enjoying the familiar rhythm of the work. Sight through the theodolite, call out the angle, wait for the chainmen to measure, record in the notebook, adjust, and repeat. It was honest labor, the kind that left a man tired in body, but clear in mind, unlike the mental exhaustion that came from navigating the subtle social currents of the estate. Around midday, as they paused for bread and cheese, Samuel Hartley appeared, walking with the purposeful stride of a man who considered every moment away from his ledgers a moment wasted. The estate manager was 45, Thomas judged, with prematurely gray hair and hands that showed no calluses despite his agricultural responsibilities. He surveyed their equipment with an expression of mild disapproval. "Lord Thornwick asked me to check on your progress," Hartley announced, though something in his tone suggested he'd have come regardless. "I trust you're finding everything satisfactory?" "Quite satisfactory," Thomas replied, noting how Hartley's eyes kept returning to the theodolite's position. "We're establishing our initial triangulation network today." "I see." Hartley produced a small notebook of his own, considerably newer and more expensive than Thomas's worn journal. "And this requires you to focus on the lake." "I should have thought the agricultural lands would be of more immediate interest. The tenant farms, for instance, have rather unclear boundaries that cause no end of disputes." Thomas recognized the attempted redirection and wondered at its purpose. "Lord Thornwick specifically mentioned the lake as requiring attention. Besides, water features serve as excellent reference points for the rest of the survey." "Of course," Hartley conceded, though his jaw tightened slightly. "I merely thought efficiency might be better served by addressing the revenue-generating portions of the estate first. The lake, after all, produces nothing but the occasional pike for his lordship's table." Before Thomas could respond, a figure in black appeared on the path from the house. Reverend Arthur Pennyweather, recognizable by his clerical collar and the somewhat distracted air that seemed to hover around him like incense. The Reverend, 61 and showing every year of it in his stooped shoulders, carried a leather satchel that bulged with what appeared to be notebooks. "Mr. Whitmore," he called out with genuine pleasure, "I heard we had a man of science visiting. I wonder if I might have a word." Hartley excused himself with visible relief, striding back toward the house with renewed urgency. The Reverend took his place, settling onto a convenient rock with a slight wheeze. "I understand you're investigating our local mystery," he said, gesturing toward the lake. "I'm surveying the estate," Thomas corrected carefully. "If mysteries resolve themselves in the process, so much the better." The Reverend smiled, a knowing expression that suggested he'd heard such diplomatic responses before. "Quite right, quite right. Still, you might find my collection of observations useful." He patted his satchel. 23 years of documented sightings, atmospheric conditions, and related phenomena. I fancy myself something of a natural philosopher, you see." Thomas's interest sharpened. Here was another methodical observer, someone who might provide data rather than superstition. "I would be very interested in your records, Reverend." "Thought you might be." The old man pulled out a notebook, seemingly at random, and opened it to a marked page. "June 20th, 1854. The island appeared at 5:17 in the morning, remained visible until 6:43. Temperature at dawn, 53 degrees. Barometric pressure, 29.92 inches. Lake surface, dead calm. Most interestingly, I noticed that birds actively avoided flying over the island's location, even when it wasn't visible." This last detail made Thomas look up from the notebook. "Birds avoided it?" "Consistently. I've observed it dozens of times. They'll fly around that spot in the lake even on days when the island doesn't manifest. Rather suggests something's there even when we can't see it, wouldn't you say?" That evening, Thomas dined with the family in the main house, an obligation he'd tried to avoid, but which Lord Thornwick had insisted upon. The dining room, lit by a chandelier that could have illuminated a small church, seemed designed to make guests feel simultaneously honored and diminished. Thomas found himself seated between Lady Catherine and Margaret Bellwether, the latter having been included, he suspected, to even the numbers, rather than from any genuine social recognition. "How goes the measuring, Mr. Whitmore?" Lady Catherine asked, her tone suggesting genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "My husband seems quite anxious for results." "These things take time, my lady," Thomas replied, noting Lord Thornwick's quick glance from the head of the table. "Accuracy requires patience." "Rather like a detective story," James interjected from across the table, his third glass of wine evident in his slightly slurred speech. "Following clues, eliminating suspects, until only the truth remains." "An apt comparison," Thomas agreed, watching James carefully. "Though in my case, the suspect is the landscape itself, and the crime is usually nothing more than imprecise previous documentation." "Still," James persisted, leaning forward with the intensity of the slightly drunk, "you must encounter secrets, things people would rather not have mapped." The table fell silent for a moment, the only sound the soft clink of silverware on china. Lord Thornwick cleared his throat. "I'm sure Mr. Whitmore exercises appropriate discretion in his work." "Of course," Thomas said quietly, but he caught the quick glance that passed between Lord Thornwick and his wife, a moment of wordless communication that spoke of shared concerns. After dinner, as Thomas walked back to the coach house through the gathering dusk, he found Margaret beside him, having apparently decided to return to the library for evening work. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke. "You should know that James has significant debts, gambling mostly. His father has refused to cover them anymore." Thomas absorbed this information, understanding it as the gift it was meant to be. "And he hopes to find something on the estate valuable enough to clear them." "Perhaps," Margaret said carefully. "Or perhaps he knows of something valuable that's already here, hidden." They had reached the point where their paths diverged, she to the library, he to his quarters. As she turned to go, Thomas called after her softly. "Miss Bellwether, what happened to your father?" She paused but didn't turn back. "He died 3 years ago. A boating accident on the lake. He was checking something for Lord Thornwick, apparently. Something important enough to go out despite a coming storm." For 6 consecutive mornings, Thomas positioned himself at the lake's edge before dawn, his notebooks and instruments arranged with surgical precision. The ghost island had appeared on 4 of those mornings, always at slightly different times, but invariably when the temperature differential between air and water reached that critical threshold the 18th century Thornwick had noted. By June 24th, Thomas had accumulated enough observational data to form a hypothesis that would have delighted any member of the Royal Society. The phenomenon, he had determined, was indeed a superior mirage, what the French called a fata morgana, after the Arthurian sorceress who supposedly created castles in the air. When cold air sat atop the warmer lake surface in perfectly still conditions, light bent in remarkable ways, creating inverted and elevated images of objects that might be miles distant, or, more intriguingly, reflecting and magnifying something beneath the water's surface. Thomas sat at his work table, calculating refraction angles with the devotion of a monk illuminating manuscripts. The mathematics were beautiful in their clarity. Snell's law applied to atmospheric layers of varying density, creating a lens of air that could make the impossible appear solid. He'd seen similar phenomena in the Arctic accounts he'd read, where entire mountain ranges appeared floating above the horizon, or ships sailed upside down through the sky. "You're working late again," Margaret's voice came from his doorway. She'd taken to bringing him tea in the evenings, a kindness he suspected she extended to no one else on the estate. Tonight, she carried not just tea, but a leather portfolio that looked considerably older than either of them. "The best insights come when the world is quiet," Thomas replied, grateful for both the company and the beverage. He noticed she'd let her hair down from its usual severe arrangement, and in the lamplight, she looked younger, less guarded. She set the portfolio on his table with unusual care. "I found something you should see. It was hidden behind other volumes. Deliberately, I think. It's a survey from 1841, but not an official one, more like private observations." Thomas opened the portfolio carefully, finding loose pages covered in a careful hand he didn't recognize. The first page bore a title, "Investigations into the Optical Phenomena of Thornwick Lake, with particular attention to the practical applications thereof." "Practical applications?" Thomas murmured, intrigued. As he read further, his interest sharpened into something approaching alarm. The unnamed author had not only understood the mirage effect, but had experimented with enhancing it. There were diagrams of reflective surfaces positioned underwater, calculations for optimal placement to create predictable manifestations. Someone was deliberately creating the ghost island? He asked, though it was more statement than question. Margaret nodded slowly. Or at least controlling when and how it appeared. Look at the last entry. Thomas turned to the final page, dated September 3rd, 1841. The writing here was hasty, agitated. E.T. has discovered my investigations. He insists the apparatus serves a greater purpose, protecting something that must remain hidden. I fear what he might do to preserve this secret. If something happens to me, let it be known that beneath the illusion lies—" The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen apparently having been abandoned in haste. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. E.T. would be Edmund Thornwick, the current lord's father. Most likely, Margaret confirmed, he died in 1843, supposedly of natural causes, though my father once mentioned that the old lord's death was rather sudden. Before Thomas could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. Footsteps on the gravel path, moving with the deliberate quietness of someone trying not to be heard. Thomas quickly closed the portfolio and slid it beneath his maps. Margaret moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "It's James," she whispered. "He's heading toward the boathouse." They watched as James Thornwick's figure, barely visible in the moonlight, made his way down to the lake. He carried something, a bag or satchel, and moved with purpose despite what must have been considerable wine consumption at dinner. Thomas grabbed his field glass and trained it on the young man, watching as he uncovered a small rowing boat and began to push it into the water. "He's going to the island location," Thomas said quietly. "At night, when there's no mirage to guide him." "Which means he knows exactly where to go," Margaret added, her quick mind following the same path as his. "He's been there before." They watched James row out into the darkness, his course straight and true toward the spot where Ghost Island materialized in the dawn light. Thomas made rapid notes of the bearing and estimated distance. After perhaps 20 minutes, James stopped rowing and appeared to be searching for something in the water, using a long pole to probe beneath the surface. "Should we alert someone?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Not yet," Thomas replied. "We need to understand what he's looking for before we act, though I suspect I'll need to make my own nocturnal expedition soon." A knock at the door interrupted them, so unexpected that Margaret actually gasped. Thomas opened it to find William Hartwell, his hired chainman, standing in the doorway with an expression of barely controlled anxiety. "Begging your pardon for the late hour, Mr. Whitmore, but I thought you should know. Someone's been at your equipment. The theodolite's been tampered with." Thomas pushed past him, hurrying to where he'd left the instrument secured for the night. Even in the moonlight, he could see the damage, subtle but deliberate. Someone had adjusted the leveling screws and loosened the horizontal axis, changes that wouldn't be immediately visible, but would throw off every measurement by degrees that would compound into yards over distance. "When did you notice this?" Thomas asked, already suspecting the answer. "Just now, sir. I came back to retrieve my coat and thought to check everything was secure for tomorrow." "I know how particular you are about the instruments." Thomas knelt beside the theodolite, his fingers finding each point of sabotage with the familiarity of long practice. This wasn't random vandalism. Whoever had done this understood surveying equipment. They'd known exactly how to create errors that might go unnoticed for days, corrupting all his data in the process. "Can you fix it?" Margaret asked, having followed them out. "Yes, but that's not the real question," Thomas replied, his mind working through the implications. "The question is why someone wants my survey to fail, or at least to be inaccurate in specific ways." He looked out toward the lake where James's boat was now returning to shore. The young man rowed with the exhausted determination of someone who'd been searching for something and hadn't found it. Or perhaps, Thomas thought, who'd found something wasn't where it was supposed to be. "William," Thomas said, turning to his assistant, "from now on we work in split shifts. You and your brother take the standard daylight hours, but I'll be conducting additional observations before dawn and after dusk, and the equipment stays in my room at night." William nodded, understanding that the survey had become something more than a simple mapping exercise. As he departed, Margaret lingered, her presence a comfort Thomas wouldn't have expected to value so highly. "You're going to need help," she said simply. "Whatever's hidden in that lake, it's been protected for over 20 years. Lord Thornwick won't simply let you uncover it." "And yet he hired me to survey the estate," Thomas pointed out. "Why bring in someone known for precision if you have secrets to hide?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, then offered a possibility that chilled Thomas more than the thought of deliberate sabotage. "Unless he doesn't know the secret exists." "Unless someone else has been maintaining it all this time, and Lord Thornwick genuinely believes he's simply updating his estate maps." Thomas considered this as he watched James finally reach the shore and drag his boat onto the shingle. The young man's shoulders were slumped in defeat or frustration, but there was something else in his posture. Fear, perhaps. The fear of someone who'd discovered that a secret he'd counted on was no longer secure. "Then we have two mysteries," Thomas said quietly. "What's hidden in the lake, and who's been hiding it?" The lead weight dropped into the dark water with a soft splash, the marked rope playing out through Thomas's hands with practiced steadiness. 30 feet, 35, 40. Then, unexpectedly, the line went slack at 43 feet, far shallower than the surrounding depths he'd been recording all morning. He noted the anomaly in his waterproofed notebook, the third such inconsistency he'd found in this particular section of the lake. It was June 28th, and Thomas had been conducting systematic soundings for 3 days, working in a grid pattern that would have seemed obsessive to anyone not familiar with hydrographic surveying. Joseph Hartwell managed the oars with quiet efficiency, having overcome his initial reluctance to venture into the Ghost Island waters through a combination of increased wages and Thomas's matter-of-fact treatment of the whole business. "Another shallow spot, Mr. Whitmore?" Joseph asked, pulling smoothly on the oars to maintain their position against the slight breeze. "Indeed," Thomas replied, hauling up the lead weight and examining the tallow at its base, which would pick up traces of the bottom composition. Instead of the usual mud and silt, he found fragments of what appeared to be worked stone. And not naturally occurring, I think. The pattern emerging from his measurements suggested something substantial beneath the water, a foundation perhaps, or a collapsed structure. The shallow points formed a rough rectangle approximately 40 feet by 25 feet, oriented north-south. Whatever lay beneath had been there long enough to accumulate several feet of sediment, but not enough to completely obscure its outline. As they moved to the next sounding position, Thomas noticed Samuel Hartley standing on the shore, watching their progress through what appeared to be a pair of field glasses. The estate manager had taken an increasingly obvious interest in the lake survey, often appearing at odd hours to observe their work. This morning, however, he wasn't alone. Lord Thornwick himself stood beside him, and even at this distance, Thomas could sense their agitation. "Perhaps we should return to shore," Joseph suggested nervously. "His lordship seems to want a word." Thomas considered this, then shook his head. "5 more soundings. His lordship hired me to be thorough, and thorough I shall be." But as he prepared the next drop, something in the water caught his eye. A glint of metal perhaps 10 feet below the surface, visible only because the afternoon sun hit it at precisely the right angle. Thomas made a mental note of the location, correlating it with his existing measurements. Whatever was down there wasn't entirely stone. When they finally returned to shore, Lord Thornwick was pacing the shingled beach with the restless energy of a man unaccustomed to being made to wait. His usual jovial manner had been replaced by something harder, more calculating. "Whitmore," he began without preamble, "Hartley here tells me you've been taking soundings all week. Surely that level of detail isn't necessary for a topographical survey?" "On the contrary, your lordship," Thomas replied, maintaining his professional calm. "The accurate mapping of water features requires understanding their depth profiles. It affects everything from drainage patterns to flood risk assessment." Lord Thornwick's eyes narrowed slightly. "And have you found anything unusual?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Thomas could lie, claim everything was normal, but something in Lord Thornwick's manner suggested he already knew better. "I've found some interesting variations in depth that suggest historical modifications to the lake bed, possibly old pier foundations or something similar." "Historical modifications," Lord Thornwick repeated slowly. "From when, would you estimate?" "Difficult to say precisely without closer examination, but based on the sediment accumulation, I'd guess at least 70 to 80 years. The relief that flickered across Lord Thornwick's face was so brief, Thomas might have imagined it. "Well, this estate has stood for over 2 centuries. I'm sure there are many forgotten structures beneath the water. Boathouses, fishing platforms, that sort of thing." Before Thomas could respond, a shout from the house interrupted them. James Thornwick was striding down the lawn, his gait unsteady enough to suggest he'd started drinking early, even by his standards. "Father, I demand to know what this man has discovered." "James, return to the house," Lord Thornwick commanded, but his son continued forward, reaching them just as Lady Catherine appeared on the terrace, watching the scene with obvious concern. "He's found it, hasn't he?" James said, his words slightly slurred, but his eyes sharp with desperate cunning. "The foundation, the old tower base." "You're drunk," Lord Thornwick stated coldly. "Go inside before you embarrass yourself further." But James turned to Thomas, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "There was a tower here once, you know, for observing the stars, supposedly. My grandfather tore it down in 41. said it was structurally unsound. But that wasn't the real reason. "James!" Lord Thornwick's voice cracked like a whip, but his son continued, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. "There's something down there. Something grandfather hid. I've been looking for it for months, ever since I found references in the old accounts. Payments to workmen for special construction that don't match any building on the estate." Hartley stepped forward, ostensibly to help restrain James, but Thomas noticed how his hand went to the young man's pocket, deftly extracting what looked like a folded paper. The movement was so smooth that Lord Thornwick, focused on his son's face, didn't notice. "Take him inside," Lord Thornwick ordered, and Hartley complied, leading the stumbling James away. When they were out of earshot, Lord Thornwick turned back to Thomas, his composure restored, but his eyes weary. "My son has romantic notions about hidden treasures and family secrets. Too many novels, I'm afraid. The tower he mentioned did exist. I remember it vaguely from my childhood, but it was simply an folly, built by an ancestor with pretensions to astronomy. Nothing more." Thomas nodded, but his mind was racing. The measurements, the metal glimpse, James's desperate searching, the sabotage of his equipment. All of it pointed to something more than an old observatory foundation. That evening, Thomas worked late in his room, correlating all his soundings onto a master chart. The pattern was unmistakable now. Not just a foundation, but what appeared to be a sealed chamber or vault, approximately 8 feet square, positioned exactly where the ghost island appeared in the morning mists. A soft knock interrupted his work. Margaret entered, carrying not tea, but a small leather journal. "This was my father's," she said without preamble. "I thought you should see it." Thomas opened the journal to the marked page, dated just a week before Margaret's father's death. The entry was brief but devastating. "Confirmed ET's suspicions. The chamber remains watertight. Contents appear intact through the viewing port. God help us all if it's ever opened. The shame would destroy the family. Must maintain the deception. The ghost island protects it better than any lock." "Your father knew," Thomas said quietly. Margaret nodded, tears threatening, but held in check through sheer will. "He died trying to reinforce something down there. A storm came up suddenly," they said, "but I've always wondered if he simply chose not to return. If the weight of keeping such a secret became too much." Thomas reached out, almost touching her hand before propriety stopped him. "What do you think is down there?" "Evidence," she said simply, "of something terrible enough that 3 generations have conspired to keep it hidden. Something that even James, desperate as he is for money, seems frightened to actually find." Through the window, the lake lay silver black under the stars, keeping its secrets beneath the dark water. Tomorrow, Thomas decided, he would need to craft a different kind of survey equipment. Something that could see what lay beneath the mud and stone. Something that could finally answer the question that seemed to haunt everyone connected to Thornwick Estate. Reverend Arthur Pennyweather's study resembled nothing so much as a naturalist's cabinet of curiosities that had collided with a theological library and somehow achieved harmony in the wreckage. Thomas sat in a leather chair that had seen better decades, surrounded by mounted specimens of local birds, pressed flowers, geological samples, and enough books to stock a small university. The Reverend himself presided over this scholarly chaos with the serene confidence of someone who knew exactly where everything was, even if no one else could fathom the system. "Sugar?" the Reverend asked, pouring tea from a pot that seemed to have been designed more for chemical experiments than refreshment. It was the 2nd of July, and Thomas had come seeking the old man's accumulated knowledge about the Ghost Island, having exhausted the estate's official records. "No, thank you," Thomas replied, accepting the cup while eyeing its slightly greenish tinge with suspicion. "Reverend, you mentioned you've been documenting the island appearances for over 2 decades. 23 years, 4 months, and 11 days to be precise," Pennyweather said, pulling a stack of journals from beneath what appeared to be a stuffed badger. "Started the morning after I arrived in the parish." Seemed like the sort of thing that warranted scientific investigation. Thomas opened the first journal, finding meticulous records that would have done credit to the Royal Observatory. Times, temperatures, barometric pressures, wind directions, visibility measurements, all recorded in a cramped but consistent hand. But it was the marginalia that caught his attention, little notes about local reactions, stories told, people who claimed to have attempted to reach the island. "You see the pattern, of course," the Reverend said, watching Thomas's face with keen intelligence. "The island appears most frequently during periods of family crisis. When old Lord Thornwick died in 43, it manifested every morning for 2 weeks. When his eldest son, Francis, disappeared in 38, same thing." "You're suggesting a supernatural connection?" Thomas asked carefully. The Reverend chuckled, a dry sound like autumn leaves. "Not at all, my dear fellow. I'm suggesting human intervention. Someone ensures the island appears during times when the family needs reminding of consequences. A sort of memento mori rendered in mist and light." Thomas considered this as he turned pages, finding a section marked Local Testimonies. Here were accounts from villagers, servants, fishermen, people who'd lived with the Ghost Island legend all their lives. One entry, dated 1855, particularly caught his attention. "Old Tom Craddock's father saw men working on the lake one night in 41, Thomas read aloud. "They were sinking something large, using a barge that wasn't from the estate." "Yes, I interviewed him myself," the Reverend confirmed. "He was quite specific about the date, September 15th, 1841, 3 days after the factory accident at Lord Thornwick's textile mill, the one that killed 17 workers when a floor collapsed due to, allegedly, structural defects that had been reported but ignored." Thomas looked up sharply. This was new information, something not in any estate record he'd seen. "There was an investigation?" "Of sorts. The magistrate was Lord Thornwick's cousin. The architect who signed off on the building's safety was heavily in debt to the family. The workers' families received modest compensation and signed documents promising never to speak of the matter again." The Reverend's tone remained neutral, but his eyes held a sadness that spoke of long contemplation of human nature's darker aspects. "And you think evidence of the true circumstances ended up in the lake?" "I think," the Reverend said carefully, "that shortly after the accident, Lord Thornwick commissioned a special waterproof chamber to be constructed and sunk. I think the Ghost Island legend, which had existed in minor form before, was deliberately enhanced to keep people away from that spot. And I think at least one person in each generation since has known the truth and maintained the deception." Before Thomas could respond, the study door opened and Lady Catherine entered, her appearance in the vicarage unexpected enough to make both men rise. She was dressed for riding, but had clearly walked, her boots showing traces of the muddy path from the estate. "Lady Thornwick," the Reverend said with genuine warmth, "what brings you to my dusty sanctuary?" Mr. Whitmore's presence here, actually, she replied, turning those intelligent eyes on Thomas. My husband is concerned about the direction your survey is taking. He asked me to remind you that your commission is for mapping, not archaeology. With respect, my lady, accurate mapping sometimes requires understanding what lies beneath the surface, Thomas replied, meeting her gaze steadily. I can't chart the lake's features without knowing what affects its depths and currents. Lady Catherine moved to the window that overlooked the churchyard, her back to them as she spoke. Mr. Whitmore, do you have family? The change of subject caught Thomas off guard. A sister, my lady, widowed with 3 children. And you support them? As I can, yes. She turned back to face him, and Thomas saw not threat but genuine concern in her expression. Then perhaps you understand the lengths to which one might go to protect family. My husband is not a bad man, Mr. Whitmore, but he inherited more than just an estate and title. He inherited responsibilities, obligations, and yes, secrets that weren't of his making. Are you warning me off, Lady Thornwick? I'm trying to prevent unnecessary pain, she said quietly. Some truths serve no purpose in being revealed. The people hurt by that factory accident are long dead. Their families were compensated. What good comes from disturbing their rest? What good comes from maintaining a lie? Thomas countered, though gently. Lady Catherine was quiet for a moment, then spoke with unexpected vulnerability. My husband doesn't know the full truth. He knows there's something in the lake his father wanted kept secret, but not what. He's maintained the arrangement out of filial duty. If you expose this, you won't just be revealing old crimes. You'll be destroying a man who's tried to live honorably within the constraints he inherited. The Reverend cleared his throat. If I may, there's another consideration. James Thornwick has been making inquiries in the village, offering money for information about the lake. He's desperate, Lady Thornwick. Desperate enough to do something foolish. Lady Catherine's composure cracked slightly. James thinks there's treasure down there. Gold or jewels hidden by his grandfather. He has no idea. She trailed off, then gathered herself. Mr. Whitmore, I came to ask, no, to beg, that you complete your survey without investigating the lake bottom further. Map the surface, chart the depths if you must, but leave what's beneath undisturbed. Thomas was about to respond when a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window they could see James Thornwick arguing with Samuel Hartley near the church gate. The estate manager appeared to be physically preventing James from entering the churchyard, and their voices, while not distinct, carried the unmistakable tone of serious conflict. Excuse me, Lady Catherine said, moving toward the door with swift grace. But before she could exit, James broke free from Hartley and came storming into the vicarage, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. Where is it? He demanded, looking wildly between the 3 of them. The record! The proof! Father's hidden it somewhere, and you all know where. James, you're not well, Lady Catherine said firmly. Come back to the house. But James laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. Not well? I'm perfectly well, stepmother. Well enough to know that everyone's protecting something in that damned lake. Well enough to know that Whitmore here has found something with all his measuring and calculating. He turned to Thomas, his eyes desperate. Tell me what you found. I'll pay you. Whatever my father's paying, I'll double it when I come into my inheritance. Which won't be for many years, God willing, Lady Catherine said coldly. "Unless Father's guilty of what I think he is," James shot back. "Unless there's proof down there that would see him hanged for murder." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the Reverend, who'd weathered many family crises in his years of ministry, seemed shocked by the naked accusation. James, perhaps realizing he'd gone too far, stumbled backward, then fled the study, leaving the others in stunned stillness. The dredging apparatus Thomas had constructed was an ungainly thing, assembled from parts begged and borrowed from the estate's workshop. Iron pipes, canvas, rope, and a weighted grappling hook modified with additional tines. It looked more like a medieval siege weapon than surveying equipment, but Thomas had tested it in the shallows and knew it would serve his purpose. The pre-dawn hour of July 5th offered perfect conditions. Dead calm, no moon, and most importantly, no witnesses. Thomas rowed alone, having deliberately excluded the Hartwell brothers from this expedition. The oars dipped silently into the black water as he navigated by compass and instinct toward the coordinates he'd memorized. The ghost island hadn't appeared for 3 days, as if the lake itself had decided to withhold its illusions during this critical moment. Reaching the designated spot, Thomas carefully lowered his dredge, feeling the weight pull the rope through his hands until it hit bottom at 43 feet. He began the methodical process of dragging, lifting, examining, adjusting position, and repeating. On the 7th attempt, the hooks caught something that didn't feel like lake bottom or stone. The weight was considerable but manageable. As Thomas hauled carefully, hand over hand, he felt the object break free from the mud that had held it for over 20 years. When it finally broke the surface, he saw a brass box, perhaps 18 inches square, its surface green with verdigris, but intact. The craftsmanship was exceptional: sealed joints, reinforced corners, and a lock mechanism that had been designed to withstand decades underwater. Thomas secured the box to his boat and began rowing back. But he'd barely covered 50 yards when he heard another boat approaching fast. Turning, he saw 2 figures, Samuel Hartley and someone else, pulling hard at the oars. They'd been watching, waiting. "Mr. Whitmore," Hartley called across the water, "stay where you are!" But Thomas had no intention of surrendering his find so easily. He pulled harder, his surveyor's strength serving him well, but Hartley's boat had 2 rowers and was gaining. Just as they drew alongside, the second figure raised something. A pistol, Thomas realized with a shock of fear. "That property belongs to Lord Thornwick," Hartley said, his usual administrative manner replaced by something harder. "You'll hand it over immediately." "Lord Thornwick hired me to survey his estate thoroughly," Thomas replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the weapon pointed at him. "This is part of that survey." The other man, one of Hartley's assistants from the estate office, kept the pistol trained on Thomas while Hartley reached for the box. But as he leaned across, their boat rocked, and Thomas seized the moment. He didn't try to escape, but instead deliberately capsized his own boat, plunging into the frigid water along with the box. The lake was shockingly cold, even in July. Thomas heard shouts above as he sank, his hands maintaining their grip on the box, despite its weight pulling him down. His lungs burned, but he kicked sideways, swimming underwater in a direction he hoped would confuse his pursuers. When he finally surfaced, gasping, he was 30 feet from both overturned boats, where Hartley and his assistant were struggling to stay afloat, neither, apparently, being strong swimmers. Training his effort on reaching shore rather than escape, Thomas helped both men to shallow water, the box temporarily forgotten in the necessity of preventing drowning. As they all collapsed on the shingle, exhausted and shivering, Thomas saw the brass box had come to rest in the shallows, half buried in mud, but still visible. "You could have killed us all," Hartley gasped, his administrative dignity thoroughly destroyed. "Your man pulled a gun on me," Thomas replied. "I'd say we're even." Before Hartley could respond, lights appeared from the house, servants with lanterns drawn by the commotion. Among them came Lord Thornwick himself, still in his nightclothes with a greatcoat thrown over them. His eyes took in the scene, the soaked men, the overturned boats, and most significantly, the brass box gleaming dully in the lantern light. "So," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume, "it's been found at last." He walked to the box, stood looking down at it for a long moment, then turned to Thomas. "You've been thorough indeed, Mr. Whitmore. More thorough than perhaps was wise." He gestured to the servants. "Bring the box to my study. And get these men warm clothes and brandy." An hour later, Thomas sat in Lord Thornwick's study, wearing borrowed clothes that fit poorly, nursing his third brandy. The brass box sat on the desk between them, still locked, still keeping its secrets. Lord Thornwick hadn't touched it, just stared at it, as if it might open of its own accord. "My father had this made," he finally said, "in September of 1841. I was 16, away at school. When I came home for Christmas that year, he was different, aged, haunted. He told me that if anything happened to him, I was never to disturb what he'd hidden in the lake. He made me swear on my mother's grave." "And you never knew what it contained?" Lord Thornwick shook his head. "I had my suspicions. The timing, you see. Just after the factory accident. Father paid out large sums to the victims' families, far more than legally required. I thought perhaps it was his confession, an admission of guilt he couldn't bear to have known, but couldn't bear to destroy either." "Your son James believes it's evidence that could see you hanged," Thomas said carefully. Lord Thornwick's laugh was bitter. "James knows nothing. He's invented a treasure to justify his searches. But what he's really looking for is power over me. He thinks if he can find something to hold over my head, I'll cover his debts forever." He paused, then asked, "Can you open it? The lock, I mean, without destroying it?" Thomas examined the mechanism. It was complex, but not impossible. His years of working with precise instruments had given him skills with delicate machinery. "I believe so, yes. But Lord Thornwick, are you certain you want to know what's inside?" The older man was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I've lived with this shadow for 20 years. Whatever the truth is, it can't be worse than the uncertainty." Thomas worked carefully with improvised picks made from pen nibs and watch springs. After 20 minutes of delicate manipulation, the lock clicked open. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them perfectly, were documents. Thomas lifted them out carefully, laying them on the desk. The first was a report from a building inspector, not the official one, but a second assessment commissioned privately. It detailed massive structural flaws in the factory building, problems that made collapse not just possible, but inevitable. The second was correspondence between Lord Edmund Thornwick and his architect, discussing how to hide these flaws from the official inspector. The third, most damning, was a letter from Lord Thornwick to his foreman, instructing him to increase production despite knowing the danger, because a large contract deadline was approaching. "Murder," Lord Thornwick whispered, his face gray. He knew, and he let those people die for profit. But there was one more document at the bottom, Thomas lifted it out, recognizing Margaret's father's handwriting. It was dated just a week before his death. The truth about the factory accident must never be revealed, not to protect the guilty who are beyond earthly justice, but to protect the innocent. The compensation paid to families came with legal agreements. If fraud is proven, those agreements become void. The families would have to repay money long since spent on food, shelter, education. Children now grown would lose their homes. The truth would destroy more lives than the original crime. Let the dead keep their secrets. Let the living keep their peace. Lord Thornwick read this final document twice, then looked at Thomas with eyes that seemed to have aged a decade in minutes. "You're Margaret's father." He understood the full weight of it. "He wasn't the only one maintaining the Ghost Island illusion," Thomas said, pieces falling into place. "Hartley knew too. That's why he tried to stop me." "Hartley's father was the foreman who received that letter," Lord Thornwick said quietly. "The guilt destroyed him. He took his own life a year later. Samuel has been protecting both our families' shame ever since." The documents lay spread across Lord Thornwick's desk like a map of moral devastation, each page revealing another layer of the conspiracy that had claimed 17 lives and haunted 3 generations. Thomas studied them with the same methodical attention he applied to his surveys, cataloging dates, names, and most importantly, the legal implications that Margaret's father had understood so clearly. "These compensation agreements," Thomas said, pointing to a particular clause in one contract, "they're contingent on the accident being classified as unforeseeable. If negligence is proven, even now, the families would indeed be liable for repayment, with interest." Lord Thornwick had moved to the window, staring out at the lake where dawn was beginning to break. 17 families. Most of them have prospered modestly with that money. The Hartwell brothers you employ. Their grandfather died in that collapse. The compensation put their father through school, bought the family cottage. The weight of this revelation settled on Thomas like a surveyor's chain. He'd been working alongside descendants of the victims, never knowing the connection. "How many others?" "Half the village in one way or another," Lord Thornwick replied. "My father was generous in his guilt. Too generous, perhaps. It's what started the financial difficulties that plague us still." He turned from the window. "What would you do, Mr. Whitmore? You're a man of precision, of facts. What does your moral compass tell you?" Before Thomas could answer, the study door burst open. James stood there, wild-eyed and disheveled, clearly having spent the night drinking and planning. Behind him, incredibly, stood Margaret, her face set with determination. "I tried to stop him," she said to Lord Thornwick, "but he insisted on knowing the truth." James stumbled forward, focusing on the documents with the intensity of the desperately drunk. "Evidence," he slurred. "I knew it. What is it, Father? What crime did grandfather commit that you've been hiding?" Lord Thornwick's response surprised everyone. He simply gestured to the papers. "Read for yourself, James. Learn what inheritance truly means in this family." As James bent over the documents, his expression changed from triumph to confusion to horror. Thomas watched the young man's face as he processed the implications. Not treasure, but shame. Not power, but responsibility. Not freedom, but the weight of maintaining a necessary deception. 17 people, James whispered, suddenly sober. Grandfather knew the building would collapse? He knew it might, Lord Thornwick corrected. He gambled with their lives and lost. James sank into a chair, the fight completely gone from him. And you've been protecting him all this time? Not him, Margaret interjected quietly. The living. My father understood it first. If this becomes public, the legal ramifications would destroy half the county. Families who've built honest lives on that compensation would lose everything. Thomas found himself studying Margaret with new respect. She'd known, or at least suspected, more than she'd revealed. You brought James here deliberately, he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. He needed to understand. The weight his father carries, the reason for the secretiveness. James isn't cruel, just lost. I thought perhaps the truth might anchor him. James looked up at his father with tears in his eyes. I'm sorry. I thought you were weak, hiding something out of cowardice. But you've been protecting everyone, haven't you? Even me, from knowing what our wealth was built on. Lord Thornwick moved to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. We're all protecting each other, James. That's what community means, even when it's built on tragedy. But what about justice? Thomas asked, voicing the question that his methodical mind couldn't dismiss. Don't the dead deserve truth? The dead are beyond caring, Margaret said softly. It's the living who need our consideration. She moved to the desk, gathering the documents with careful hands. Mr. Whitmore, you came here to create a map, to document what exists. But some features of the landscape are better left uncharted. Thomas understood what she was asking, what they were all asking, to complete his survey but omit this discovery, to perpetuate a deception that had become paradoxically a kind of truth in itself. The Ghost Island would remain a legend, a mirage that protected a secret, that protected a community. There's still the matter of the mechanism, Thomas said slowly. The apparatus underwater that helps create the mirage effect. Someone's been maintaining it. Samuel Hartley entered the study then, as if summoned by the mention of his work. His clothes were still damp from their lake encounter, but he'd regained his composure. That would be me, Mr. Whitmore, as it was my father before me. A handful of precisely placed reflectors, angled to catch and concentrate the light during temperature inversions. Simple optics, really, though the positioning requires maintenance. You've been the guardian of the illusion, Thomas said with something approaching admiration. The keeper of the Ghost Island. Someone had to be, Hartley replied simply. Lord Thornwick knew the secret existed, but not its nature. I knew its nature, but needed his authority to protect it. We've been partners in ignorance, you might say. The sun had fully risen now, sending golden light across the study. Through the window, the lake sparkled innocently, giving no sign of the drama that had unfolded on its waters. Thomas made his decision, the same methodical process he used for calculating angles and distances, but applied to a more complex problem. I'll complete my survey, he announced. The lake will be mapped accurately, including depth soundings and notable features. There's an unusual optical phenomenon that occurs under certain atmospheric conditions, creating the illusion of an island. I'll document it as such, a natural curiosity that adds a natural curiosity that adds character to the estate. The relief in the room was palpable. Lord Thornwick extended his hand. You're an honorable man, Mr. Whitmore. I'm a practical man, Thomas corrected. My sister and her children benefit from my reputation for discretion as much as accuracy. Speaking of which, there's still the matter of my fee. This drew the first genuine laugh from Lord Thornwick that Thomas had heard. "Of course, and I think a bonus for exceptional thoroughness would be appropriate." As they discussed the financial details, Thomas noticed Margaret and James talking quietly in the corner. The young man was nodding earnestly at something she said, and Thomas caught the words redemption and purpose. Perhaps James would find his anchor after all, not in exposing secrets, but in protecting them. Later, as Thomas walked back to the coach house with Margaret, she slipped her hand into his, a breach of propriety that felt entirely natural. "You've done a good thing," she said. "I've done a practical thing," he replied, but squeezed her hand gently. "Though I admit the line between good and practical seems less clear than my measurements usually are." "Most important lines are," she said. "That's why we need surveyors like you, who understand that precision isn't always the same as truth." They reached the coach house where Thomas's equipment waited, ready for another day of measuring and mapping. But now he understood that he was documenting more than just landscape. He was recording the careful fiction that allowed a community to function, the precise balance between justice and mercy that kept the social machinery running. "Will you stay?" Margaret asked suddenly. After the surveys complete, Thomas thought of his sister in Manchester, of the life he'd built around his work. Then he looked at Margaret, at the estate stretching before them, at the lake with its carefully maintained mystery. "I have other commissions waiting," he said carefully. "But perhaps I could return periodically, to update the maps, check for changes, ensure the accuracy of certain phenomena." Margaret smiled, understanding the promise beneath his professional words. "The Ghost Island will need monitoring to maintain its legendary status." "Precisely," Thomas agreed. "After all, some mysteries are worth preserving." The moral weight of knowledge, Thomas reflected as he prepared his final calculations, was not something they taught you at the Ordnance Survey training. Yet here he sat, 3 days after the revelations in Lord Thornwick's study, wrestling with mathematics that had become inextricably tangled with ethics. His theodolite readings were precise to the second of arc, his chain measurements accurate to the link. But the map he was creating would contain a deliberate fiction. The Ghost Island marked as an atmospheric phenomenon, rather than a carefully maintained illusion protecting a darker truth. Lord Thornwick had summoned him that morning of July 8th with an unusual request. They were to meet not in the study but in the estate's small private chapel, a Norman structure that predated the main house by several centuries. Thomas arrived to find not just his lordship, but also Lady Catherine, James, Margaret, Samuel Hartley, and, surprisingly, Reverend Pennyweather. "A family council," Lord Thornwick explained, though family seemed an elastic term in this context. "We need to decide, collectively, how to proceed." The chapel's stone walls held a coolness that defied the July warmth outside. Thomas took a seat on one of the ancient pews, noting how the morning light through the stained glass cast colored shadows that seemed appropriate to the moral complexity of their gathering. "I've been giving this matter considerable thought," Lord Thornwick began. "The documents Mr. Whitmore recovered cannot simply be returned to the lake. Their discovery has changed things irrevocably." "Burn them," James suggested, but his tone lacked conviction. The past days had aged him visibly, the disillusion replaced by something more thoughtful. "Destroy the evidence entirely. That would be the simplest solution," Lady Catherine agreed, "but it would also leave future generations vulnerable to the same discoveries. Someone else might dredge the lake, find the chamber empty, and start asking questions that lead to the same truth by different paths. Reverend Pennyweather cleared his throat. If I may suggest an alternative, the Church has long experience in maintaining necessary secrets. These documents could be placed in the ecclesiastical archives, sealed and marked not to be opened for, shall we say, 100 years? By then, all legal ramifications would have expired. But that just delays the reckoning, Margaret pointed out. Our great-grandchildren would face the same moral dilemma. Thomas found himself speaking almost without intention. Perhaps that's as it should be. Each generation must make its own moral calculations. What seems necessary deception to us might seem unconscionable to them, or vice versa. Lord Thornwick nodded slowly. Whitmore has a point. We can't make decisions for people not yet born, but we can ensure they have all the information to make their own choices. There's another matter, Hartley interjected, his administrative mind focusing on practicalities. The families who received compensation. Some of them know or suspect the truth. Old Tom Craddock, for instance. His father saw the chamber being sunk. These people have kept silent out of loyalty or fear or understanding. Don't they deserve some consideration? This opened a discussion that revealed the true complexity of the situation. It wasn't just about the 17 families who'd lost breadwinners in the factory collapse. It was about the entire economic ecosystem of the estate and village. The suppliers who'd extended credit based on compensation payments. The school built with donated funds from Lord Thornwick's guilt-driven charity. The young men and women who'd received educations impossible without that blood money. We could establish a trust, Lady Catherine suggested. Anonymous, managed by the Church, perhaps, to provide for any families who might suffer if the truth ever emerges. With what funds? James asked, though not unkindly. Father, we both know the estate's finances. We're comfortable, but not wealthy. It was then that Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. My fee for this survey, plus the bonus his lordship mentioned, I'll contribute it to such a trust. Consider it an investment in communal stability. Margaret turned to him with an expression of such warmth that Thomas felt his carefully maintained professional composure crack slightly. You can't afford that, she said softly. Your sister will be provided for by my next commission, Thomas replied firmly. This is necessary. I'm creating a map that contains a deliberate omission. The least I can do is help protect those who might suffer from that omission's eventual discovery. Lord Thornwick stood and walked to the chapel's small window, looking out at the estate grounds. My grandfather, the one who built that factory, who sacrificed those 17 souls to Mammon, he left me a letter when he died. I was too young to receive it then, so it was held in trust. I've never shared its contents with anyone, not even Catherine. He turned back to face them. He wrote that the weight of his crime had destroyed his sanity. He saw the faces of the dead in every reflection, heard their voices in every creaking beam. He created the Ghost Island illusion not just to protect the evidence, but to punish himself. A daily reminder of the phantoms he'd created. He wrote that he prayed his descendants would be stronger than he was, would find a way to transform guilt into grace. The chapel fell silent, each person absorbed in contemplating this revelation. Finally, Reverend Pennyweather spoke. Perhaps that's what we're doing here. Transforming inherited guilt into collective responsibility. Pretty words, James said with a trace of his old bitterness. But what about justice? What about truth? What about mercy? Margaret countered. What about the truth that sometimes the greatest justice is in preventing further harm? Thomas pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd been using throughout the survey. Let me be precise about what I'm proposing to document. The lake contains an unusual optical phenomenon caused by specific atmospheric conditions interacting with underwater geological features. This phenomenon, locally known as Ghost Island, has been observed for at least 70 years and has become part of local folklore. The underwater features that contribute to this effect are of historical interest, but pose no navigational hazard. He looked up. That's truth, if not the whole truth. And the apparatus Hartley's been maintaining, Lord Thornwick asked. Will need to be removed, Thomas said firmly. The natural phenomenon is remarkable enough without artificial enhancement. Mr. Hartley, the reflectors and other equipment should be recovered before I complete my survey. Hartley nodded. I can do that tonight. The moon's dark and I know exactly where everything is positioned. Then we're agreed, Lord Thornwick asked, looking at each face in turn. The documents go to the church archives, sealed for a century. The trust fund is established for potential future needs. The survey shows the lake as it naturally is, with its peculiar atmospheric effects, and we all carry the weight of knowing what we know. One by one they nodded their agreement. Even James, who Thomas had thought might object, seemed resolved. I've been a fool, the young man said quietly, chasing phantoms of treasure when the real phantom was our family's shame. I want to help, to be part of protecting people rather than exploiting them. You could help me with the trust administration, Reverend Pennyweather suggested. A young man with your education and connections could do much good, properly directed. As the meeting disbanded, Thomas found himself walking with Lord Thornwick back toward the main house. The older man seemed to have shed years of tension in the chapel, moving with a lighter step despite the moral burden they'd all agreed to share. Whitmore, he said suddenly, that first night when you arrived, I was terrified. I'd heard of your reputation for absolute accuracy, your unwillingness to compromise on facts. I thought you'd be our undoing. Perhaps I would have been, Thomas admitted. A month ago, I'd have said truth was always preferable to deception. But I've learned that truth without context can be its own form of lie. My maps will be accurate to the inch, my lord. They just won't tell every story the landscape holds. Lord Thornwick smiled, the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from him. You're a philosopher as well as a surveyor, Whitmore. A dangerous combination. I suspect Margaret appreciates that about you. The observation was so unexpected that Thomas actually stumbled slightly. Lord Thornwick chuckled. Oh, come now, man. You think we haven't noticed? She's been practically haunting the coach house. And you've been finding excuses to visit the library, far more than any survey requires. I assure you, my lord, nothing improper. I know, Lord Thornwick interrupted. You're both too honorable for that. Which is why I'm suggesting that when you complete this survey, you might consider taking on another commission, a permanent one. The estate needs a proper surveyor in residence, someone to maintain accurate records, monitor changes, ensure that certain phenomena remain properly documented. September had arrived in the Lake District with its characteristic mix of golden afternoons and misty mornings, painting the landscape in watercolors that seemed to shift with each passing hour. Thomas Whitmore stood at the edge of Thornwick Lake for what he knew would not be the last time. His completed survey rolled in its leather case beside him, watching the dawn light play across the water where no island appeared, and hadn't for weeks since Hartley had removed the reflecting apparatus one moonless night in July. The survey was finished, all 2,000 acres reduced to precise lines and careful notations, every elevation marked, every waterway traced, every structure documented. It was, he knew with professional pride, some of his finest work. The map would serve the estate well for decades, perhaps generations. And if it contained a small fiction about atmospheric phenomena over the lake, well, even the most precise maps were ultimately interpretations of reality, rather than reality itself. Behind him, he heard footsteps on the gravel path. Margaret appeared beside him, carrying 2 cups of tea. Her presence now as natural and necessary as his surveying instruments. She'd taken to joining him for these dawn observations, these moments of quiet contemplation before the estate woke to its daily business. "No Ghost Island this morning," she observed, handing him a cup. "No," Thomas agreed, "though the conditions are almost right. Temperature differential of 8 degrees, still air, the right angle of light. Nature might have produced it on her own, even without Hartley's mirrors." "But she didn't," Margaret said. "Perhaps she knows the secret's safe now." They stood in comfortable silence, watching a heron pick its careful way along the shallows. The bird paused near the spot where the phantom island had appeared so many times, cocked its head as if listening to something beneath the water, then moved on. "Your sister arrives tomorrow," Margaret said, changing the subject with the careful delicacy she brought to all personal matters. "Yes, Mary and the children. Lord Thornwick's offer of the cottage near the mill was extraordinarily generous." Thomas still marveled at how his life had rearranged itself over the summer. The position of estate surveyor came with not just a salary, but a home, a place in the community. And though it hadn't been explicitly stated, the understanding that his relationship with Margaret could develop without the impediment of distance. "He's changed," Margaret observed, meaning Lord Thornwick. "The burden of carrying that secret alone for so long, sharing it, has freed something in him." Indeed, Thomas had noticed the difference. Lord Thornwick moved through his days with renewed purpose, working with James on establishing the trust fund, consulting with tenants about improvements, even laughing more freely. The terrible knowledge hadn't disappeared, but distributed among them all, it had become bearable. "And James," Thomas added, genuinely surprised by the transformation. The dissolute young man who'd drunkenly accused his father of murder had become Reverend Pennyweather's most dedicated assistant, throwing himself into the work of managing the trust with an energy that suggested genuine redemption rather than mere penance. "People are capable of change when they understand the true shape of the world," Margaret said philosophically. "Your maps do that for landscape. Perhaps this summer has done that for all of us, shown us the true contours of our moral geography." A sound drew their attention. The Hartwell brothers approaching with their work gear, ready for a day's labor on a drainage project Thomas had identified during his survey. William raised his cap in greeting. Joseph nodded cheerfully. They knew nothing of their grandfather's death in that factory collapse, nothing of the compensation that had shaped their family's fortunes. They were simply honest workers, living lives made possible by a tragedy they'd never know about. "Is it right?" Thomas asked suddenly, "keeping such truth from them?" Margaret considered carefully before answering. Is it right to tell a child that their comfort was bought with blood? That their education, their opportunities, their very existence in its current form springs from a crime? What purpose would such knowledge serve, except to poison their present with a past they had no part in creating? And yet we know, Thomas pointed out, we've chosen to carry that burden. Because we can, Margaret said simply. Because we're strong enough, distant enough, privileged enough to bear it without being destroyed. That's what responsibility means. Not just knowing the truth, but knowing when truth serves and when it merely wounds. They were interrupted by old Tom Craddock making his morning rounds of the grounds. The ancient groundskeeper paused near them, looking out at the lake with his usual mixture of suspicion and reverence. "No ghost this morning, Mr. Whitmore," he said, and there was something in his tone that made Thomas wonder, not for the first time, exactly how much old Tom knew or suspected. "No, Tom, just a lake being a lake." The old man nodded slowly. "Sometimes that's enough, isn't it? A lake being a lake, a map being a map, folks being folks. Not everything needs explaining." After he'd shuffled off, Margaret laughed softly. "I think old Tom might be the wisest of us all. He knows without knowing, understands without understanding." "Rather like my survey," Thomas said, pulling out the leather case. "Accurate without being complete, true without being whole." He unrolled the map one more time, studying his work in the morning light. Every line was precise, every measurement correct. The lake was marked with depth soundings, the peculiar atmospheric phenomenon noted with appropriate scientific detachment. Future generations would look at this map and see exactly what was there, no more, no less. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, tracing the contour lines with one finger. "Like a poem written in mathematics." "Now who's being philosophical?" Thomas teased gently. "You're a bad influence," she replied. Then more seriously, "Thomas, do you regret it? Coming here, learning what you've learned, becoming part of this conspiracy of mercy." Thomas thought of his original plan, to survey the estate, collect his fee, return to Manchester, and the simple clarity of measurement and angle. That life seemed to belong to someone else now, someone who believed precision was the highest virtue and truth the only goal. "I regret nothing," he said firmly. "We're all cartographers in our way, trying to map the unmappable territory between right and wrong, justice and mercy, truth and kindness. My theodolite can measure angles to the second, but it can't measure the weight of inherited guilt or the value of communal peace." A bell rang from the house, breakfast, the start of the estate's formal day. As they walked back together, Thomas rolled up his map with the careful attention it deserved. This afternoon, he would present it formally to Lord Thornwick, the commission complete. But tomorrow he would begin new measurements, tracking the seasonal changes in water levels, documenting the growth of new plantings, all the small alterations that kept an estate map current and accurate. "Margaret," he said suddenly, stopping just before they reached the house. "That first day in the library when you showed me those old surveys, did you know then what we'd find?" She smiled, that particular expression that combined intelligence and kindness in equal measure. "I knew we'd find something. My father's journal, old Tom's stories, the way everyone talked around the ghost island rather than about it. But I also knew somehow that you were the right person to find it, someone who could be precise about imprecision, accurate about ambiguity. A paradox. A human being, she corrected, which is the most complex terrain of all to survey. They entered the house together, into the warmth and noise of the breakfast room, where Lord and Lady Thornwick were discussing the day's plans, where James was earnestly explaining some detail of trust law to a patient Reverend Pennyweather, where Hartley was reviewing accounts with his usual meticulous attention. It was a scene of ordinary estate life, unremarkable except for the shared knowledge that ran beneath it like an underground stream, binding them all in their understanding of how much the ordinary cost. Thomas took his place at the table, accepting tea from Lady Thornwick, discussing the drainage project with Lord Thornwick, even managing to draw a laugh from James with a comment about the mathematical improbability of his cards luck improving. He was part of this now, this community built on tragedy and maintained by selective truth. Outside, the lake sparkled in the morning sun, keeping its secrets beneath the play of light and shadow. The ghost island was gone, perhaps forever, but its purpose remained, a reminder that some mysteries serve the living better than any revelation could. Thomas had come to map the estate and had done so with all his professional skill. But he'd also mapped something larger. The delicate topology of human compromise, the precise measurements of moral necessity, the true coordinates of home.